The community center sat on the corner of 5th Street and Madison Avenue, a simple brick building that had seen better days. The paint on the walls was fading, and some of the windows had small cracks that no one had bothered to fix. But inside the place was alive with sound and energy. Every Tuesday evening, the center hosted an open mic night, and people from all over the neighborhood came to share their talents. Tonight was no different. The main hall was filled with folding chairs arranged in neat rows facing a small stage. Young musicians tuned their guitars in the corners. A teenage girl practiced her spoken word poem, moving her hands as she whispered the words to herself. Two men set up a keyboard near the wall, arguing quietly about which outlet to use. The smell of coffee drifted from the small kitchen at the back, where volunteers sold drinks and cookies to raise money for the center. Sarah Chen stood near the registration table, clipboard in hand, checking names off her list. She was 28 years old and worked as the community center's event coordinator. This was her 3rd year organizing the open mic nights, and she had seen hundreds of performers come through those doors. Some were talented, some were just learning, and some probably should have practiced more before stepping on stage. But Sarah welcomed them all with the same warm smile. "Next up, we have Marcus with an original rap," she called out, making a note on her paper. Marcus, a 17-year-old wearing a bright red cap, gave her a thumbs up from across the room. The evening was going well. The crowd was decent-sized, maybe 40 or 50 people scattered throughout the chairs. Some were performers waiting their turn. Others were friends and family members who came to support loved ones. A few were regular community members who just enjoyed the free entertainment and the sense of togetherness these nights brought. Sarah glanced at the old piano sitting at the far side of the stage. It was a Baldwin upright, donated to the center 15 years ago by a family who was moving across the country. The wood was scratched and dull, and some of the ivory on the keys had yellowed with age. It stayed in tune reasonably well, though it needed a professional tuning at least twice a year that the center could barely afford. Tonight, like most nights, it sat unused. Most performers brought guitars or sang without instruments. Very few people played the piano anymore. The front door opened, letting in a gust of cool October air. Sarah looked up from her clipboard and saw an elderly woman step inside. She moved slowly, carefully, as if each step required thought and planning. She was small, perhaps 5 feet tall, with white hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her coat was brown and worn at the elbows, and she carried a faded cloth shopping bag in one hand. Her shoes were practical, flat, the kind made for comfort rather than style. The woman stood just inside the doorway, looking around the room with wide eyes. She seemed uncertain, almost frightened, as if she might turn around and leave at any moment. Sarah noticed her immediately. There was something about the woman's expression, a mix of hope and fear that caught her attention. "Hello," Sarah said, walking over with her friendly coordinator smile. "Welcome to open mic night. Are you here to watch or did you want to perform?" The woman's hands tightened around her shopping bag. Up close, Sarah could see she was probably in her 70s, maybe older. Her face was lined with deep wrinkles, and her hands showed the spots and thin skin of advanced age. But her eyes were sharp and clear, a striking blue that seemed to hold decades of stories. I was just walking by," the woman said softly. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "I saw the sign outside. It said open mic night. I didn't know if—" She trailed off, looking past Sarah toward the stage, toward the piano. Her gaze fixed on the instrument, and something changed in her expression. It was subtle, but Sarah noticed it. A look of longing, deep and old, crossed the woman's face. "You're welcome to stay and watch," Sarah said encouragingly. "We have all kinds of performers tonight. Singers, poets, musicians. It's a really supportive crowd. No one judges here." The woman nodded but didn't move. She kept staring at the piano. The room around them buzzed with activity and conversation, but she seemed lost in her own thoughts. "That piano," the woman finally said, still not looking at Sarah. "Does anyone play it?" "Sometimes," Sarah replied. "Not as often as we'd like. We had someone play it last month, I think. It's available if you know someone who wants to use it." The woman's lips pressed together. Her fingers worked nervously on the handles of her shopping bag, twisting the fabric. Sarah waited, sensing that the woman wanted to say something but was struggling to find the words. "I used to play," the woman said at last, so quietly that Sarah had to lean closer to hear. "A long time ago." "Oh, that's wonderful," Sarah said warmly. "Would you like to play something tonight?" There's room on the schedule. We're pretty informal here. You don't have to perform a whole piece or anything. You could just play a little test out the piano. The woman's eyes widened. Fear flashed across her face and she took a small step backward. Oh no, I couldn't. I haven't played in years. Decades, really. I wouldn't even remember how. My hands don't work like they used to. She held up her hands as if offering proof. They shook slightly and the fingers were bent with arthritis, the joints swollen and stiff-looking. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy. That's okay, Sarah said gently. But if you change your mind, just let me know. Even if you just want to sit at the piano and touch the keys, that would be fine. Sometimes people just like to reconnect with old hobbies. The woman nodded, clutching her bag tighter. Maybe I'll just sit and watch for a bit. If that's all right? Of course, Sarah said, gesturing toward the rows of chairs. Sit anywhere you like. Can I get you some coffee or tea? We have cookies, too. No, thank you, the woman said. You're very kind. She made her way slowly to a chair in the back row, far from the stage. She sat down carefully, placing her shopping bag on the floor beside her feet. Then she folded her hands in her lap and looked toward the front of the room, toward the piano. Sarah watched her for a moment, curious. There was something about this woman that tugged at her. She had seen many people come through the community center over the years. Some were lonely, some were looking for community, some were chasing old dreams. This woman seemed to be all of those things at once. The evening continued. A young man played guitar and sang a cover of a popular song. A woman in her 30s read a short story she had written. Marcus performed his rap and the crowd cheered and clapped. Through it all, the elderly woman sat in the back row watching quietly, but Sarah noticed that her eyes kept drifting to the piano. When someone walked near it, the woman would lean forward slightly in her chair. When the light hit the keys at a certain angle, making them gleam, the woman's expression would soften. About an hour into the program, there was a break. Sarah announced that they would resume in 10 minutes, and people stood up to stretch their legs, refill their coffee cups, or step outside for fresh air. Sarah made her way toward the back of the room, intending to check on the elderly woman. But the woman was already standing, moving slowly toward the stage. She walked with purpose now, though still carefully. Her shopping bag remained behind, tucked under her chair. She approached the piano as if drawn by an invisible thread, unable to resist any longer. Sarah watched from a distance, not wanting to interrupt. The woman reached the piano and stood before it for a long moment, just looking at it. She reached out one trembling hand and let her fingers hover over the keys without touching them. From where Sarah stood, she could see the woman's lips moving as if she was saying something to herself or perhaps to the piano. Then the woman pulled her hand back and turned away. She looked around the room, clearly searching for someone. Her eyes found Sarah, and she raised one hand in a small, hesitant wave. Sarah walked over quickly. "Hi," Sarah said. "The piano caught your attention?" "Yes," the woman said. Her voice was stronger now, less uncertain. "I was wondering. You mentioned earlier that I could try it. Did you mean that?" "Absolutely," Sarah said. "Would you like to play something?" The woman's hands twisted together nervously. "I don't know if I can. I really haven't played in so many years. But I thought, maybe just a few notes, just to see if my fingers remember anything at all. Would that be all right? I don't want to disturb anyone or take up time." "You wouldn't be disturbing anyone," Sarah assured her. "Actually, why don't you play something during the second half? We always have room for more performers. What do you say?" Terror and longing warred on the woman's face. "I couldn't perform. I wouldn't know what to play. Maybe I could just try it now during the break when no one is really paying attention." Sarah understood. The woman needed privacy for this moment, not an audience. "Sure," she said. "Go ahead. Take your time. I'll make sure no one bothers you." The woman looked at her with such gratitude that Sarah felt her throat tighten. "Thank you," the woman whispered. "You're very kind. My name is Dorothy, by the way. Dorothy Walsh." "I'm Sarah," Sarah said, shaking Dorothy's hand gently. The older woman's grip was weak, her skin paper thin and cool to the touch. "It's nice to meet you, Dorothy." Dorothy turned back to the piano and sat down slowly on the bench. She adjusted it slightly, moving it closer to the keys with small, shuffling movements of her feet. Her hands rested on her knees for a moment, and Sarah could see her taking deep breaths, preparing herself. Around the room, people were still on break, talking and laughing. A few noticed the elderly woman at the piano and glanced over with mild curiosity, but most paid no attention. This was an open mic night. People played instruments all the time. Sarah moved a short distance away but kept watching. She couldn't explain why, but she felt this was an important moment. Something about the way Dorothy looked at the piano, the way she had walked toward it despite her obvious fear, told Sarah that this meant something deep to the older woman. Dorothy raised her hands slowly and placed them on the keys. Even from several feet away, Sarah could see them shaking. Dorothy's fingers curved naturally over the keys, finding a position that looked practiced, professional even. For someone who claimed not to have played in decades, her hands knew exactly where to go. Dorothy pressed down on a single key, middle C. The note rang out clear and pure in the busy room. A few more people glanced over but then went back to their conversations. Dorothy pressed another key, then another. Individual notes, slow and tentative, like someone testing ice to see if it would hold their weight. Then Dorothy's right hand began to move in a simple pattern. Sarah recognized it immediately. It was a basic melody, the kind children learned when they first started piano lessons. Maybe Mary Had a Little Lamb or something similar. Dorothy played it slowly, carefully, her arthritic fingers struggling with the movements. She missed a note, had to reach for it again. Her left hand remained in her lap, not yet brave enough to join the right, but she kept playing. The simple melody continued, halting and imperfect. Sarah saw Dorothy's shoulders begin to relax slightly. Her breathing seemed to steady. A small smile, barely visible, touched the corners of her mouth. The break was ending. People started moving back to their seats. Sarah reluctantly stepped forward to let Dorothy know it was time to stop, that the program needed to continue. But before she could say anything, something changed. Dorothy's left hand rose from her lap and found its place on the lower keys. The simple melody continued in the right hand, but now the left hand added something. Just a few notes at first, basic accompaniment. But those few notes transformed everything. The children's song suddenly had depth, harmony, richness. And then Dorothy's playing began to change. Her fingers moved faster, more confidently. The simple melody evolved, adding flourishes and variations. The tempo increased. Her back straightened, her posture shifting from the hunched position of an elderly woman to something more upright, more poised. Her head tilted slightly, and her eyes, which had been watching her hands carefully, began to close. The conversations in the room didn't stop immediately. People were still talking, still moving around. But a few people near the stage paused and turned toward the piano. The music Dorothy was creating was no longer simple. It was becoming something else entirely, something that demanded attention. Sarah stood frozen, her clipboard hanging forgotten in her hand. She watched as years seemed to fall away from Dorothy Walsh. The trembling hands grew steady and sure. The uncertain, fearful woman who had stood at the door 30 minutes ago was transforming into someone else, someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The simple melody was gone now, replaced by something complex and beautiful. Dorothy's fingers flew across the keys, moving from bass to treble and back again with increasing speed and precision. Her whole body moved with the music, swaying slightly, leaning into the more powerful passages and pulling back for the gentler ones. More conversations stopped. More heads turned. The room was growing quieter. The audience's attention pulled inexorably toward the piano and the small, elderly woman who sat before it, creating music that seemed impossible for someone her age, someone with arthritic hands, someone who claimed not to have played in decades. Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms. Whatever was happening at that piano, it was extraordinary. She looked around the room and saw the same realization dawning on other faces. This was not a hobbyist noodling around. This was not someone playing a simple tune to reminisce about their youth. This was a musician, a real one. And she was just getting started. Dorothy's eyes were fully closed now, her face serene, almost peaceful. A single tear traced its way down her weathered cheek, catching the light as it fell. Her hands moved with A grace and certainty that seemed to belong to a different person entirely. Someone much younger, much stronger, much more alive. The music grew louder, filling every corner of the room, silencing the last few conversations, pulling every single person's attention to the stage. Sarah realized her mouth was hanging open. She closed it, swallowed hard, and felt her own eyes beginning to sting with unexpected tears. She didn't know what piece Dorothy was playing. She didn't recognize it, but she understood with a certainty that needed no explanation that she was witnessing something remarkable, something rare, something she would remember for the rest of her life. The break was over, but nobody moved to take the stage. Nobody wanted to. All eyes were on Dorothy Walsh, and the masterpiece that was pouring from her fingertips like water from a broken dam, decades of music held back and now finally set free. The music that filled the community center was like nothing Sarah had ever heard in this building. It was powerful and delicate at the same time, sweeping through the room like a wave. Dorothy's hands moved across the piano keys with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone her age. Her fingers danced from one end of the keyboard to the other, creating cascades of notes that built on each other, layered and complex. The last conversations in the room died completely. Even the two men who had been setting up equipment in the corner stopped what they were doing and turned to watch. Marcus, the teenage rapper who had performed earlier, stood with his mouth open, his red cap pushed back on his head. The spoken-word poet sat forward in her chair, tears already streaming down her face, though she probably didn't even realize it. Sarah felt paralyzed. She knew she should be thinking about the schedule, about the other performers waiting for their turn, about keeping the event moving forward. But none of that mattered now. Nothing mattered except the music pouring from that old beat-up piano and the transformation happening before their eyes. Dorothy's whole body was engaged now. Her shoulders moved with the rhythm, rising and falling with the dynamics of the piece. Her head swayed gently from side to side. Occasionally she would lean back slightly during a softer passage, then lean forward with intensity when the music grew louder and more passionate. It was like watching a conductor and a performer rolled into one, except Dorothy was creating every single note herself. The piece she was playing was clearly a classical work, something with history and weight behind it. Sarah didn't know much about classical music, but she knew enough to recognize mastery when she heard it. This wasn't just someone who had taken piano lessons as a child. This was someone who had devoted years, maybe decades, to the instrument. Someone who had trained seriously, professionally. A young woman sitting in the third row pulled out her phone and started recording. Within seconds, others did the same. Phones came up all around the room, capturing this unexpected moment. Sarah normally would have asked people to put their phones away during performances, but she couldn't bring herself to say anything. This needed to be recorded. This needed to be remembered. Dorothy's eyes remained closed. She was somewhere else entirely, lost in the music. Her face showed concentration, but also something deeper. Joy, pain, longing, memory. All of it flickered across her weathered features as her hands continued their impossible dance across the keys. The music built towards something. Sarah could feel it even though she didn't understand the technical aspects. The volume increased, the tempo quickened. Dorothy's hands were moving so fast now that they were almost a blur. She hit the keys with force, making the old piano ring out louder than Sarah had ever heard it. The sound filled every inch of the room, vibrating in Sarah's chest, making the air itself seem to pulse with energy. Then, just when it seemed the music couldn't possibly get any more intense, Dorothy's hands flew up and came crashing down on the keys in a series of powerful chords. The sound was enormous, shocking in its strength. It was the kind of sound that required not just technical skill but physical power, emotional force. The piano itself seemed to shake with the impact, and then, like a storm passing, the music shifted. Dorothy's hands softened. The chords became gentle, almost whispered. Her fingers moved with the lightness of a feather touching water. The melody that emerged was heartbreakingly beautiful, simple and pure after all that complexity and power. It was like hearing someone's soul speak directly, without words, without barriers. Sarah found tears running down her own cheeks. She wasn't alone. Looking around the room, she saw that nearly everyone was crying. Strong men who had come to support their kids in the open mic night were wiping their eyes, Teenagers who usually pretended nothing could move them were openly weeping. The elderly couple who came to every community event were holding hands, both with tears streaming down their faces. There was something about this music, about this moment, that cut through all the usual defenses people kept up. It reached into some deep place where words couldn't go, where age and background and circumstance didn't matter. Everyone in that room was experiencing something profound together. Dorothy continued to play. The piece moved through different sections, different moods. Sometimes it was joyful, almost playful, with little runs and trills that made it sound like laughter. Other times it turned dark and serious, the bass notes rumbling like distant thunder, creating a sense of weight and gravity. There were moments of such delicate beauty that Sarah held her breath, afraid that any sound might shatter the spell. Through it all, Dorothy's hands never hesitated. Her arthritic fingers, which had trembled when she first sat down, now moved with absolute certainty. The swollen joints that had seemed so stiff and painful looked fluid, capable, strong. It was as if the music itself was healing her, giving her back something she had lost. A memory flashed in Sarah's mind. She suddenly pictured Dorothy as a young woman, maybe 20 or 25 years old, sitting at a grand piano on a concert stage. She would have been beautiful, Sarah thought. Not because of any particular features, but because of the way she held herself, the way she commanded the instrument, the way the music flowed through her like electricity through a wire. What had happened? Sarah wondered. How does someone with this much talent, this much skill, end up walking into a community center decades later, afraid to even touch a piano? What kind of life had Dorothy lived between that imagined concert stage and this moment? The questions would have to wait. The music demanded attention. Dorothy's playing had shifted again, building toward what felt like a conclusion. The melody from earlier returned, but transformed, more complex, layered with everything that had come before. It was like watching someone gather up all the threads of a story and weave them together into something complete. Dorothy's hands moved up and down the keyboard, pulling together the different themes and ideas that had appeared throughout the piece. Fast passages alternated with slow, deliberate ones, loud and soft, major and minor, all of it swirling together in a way that made perfect sense despite the complexity. The tempo increased again. Dorothy was building to something big, something final. Her whole body leaned into the piano now, her shoulders hunched forward, her face intense with concentration. Sweat had appeared on her forehead, dampening the white hair at her temples. Her breathing was audible even over the music, coming in quick, sharp gasps as her hands flew across the keys. The music grew louder and louder. The old piano was being pushed to its limits, every string vibrating, every hammer striking. The sound filled the room completely, overwhelming, demanding everything from the listener. Sarah felt like she was being carried along by a flood, swept up in something much bigger than herself. And then Dorothy's hands rose high above the keyboard. For just a second, maybe less, they hung there in the air, trembling with the effort of everything she had just played. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as one. Her hands came down in a final thunderous chord. The piano rang out with such force that the sound seemed to go on forever, echoing off the walls, vibrating in the floor, filling every empty space. Dorothy held the chord, her fingers pressing the keys with all her strength, letting the sound build and swell and finally, slowly, gradually, fade away into silence. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. Dorothy's hands remained on the keys, her head bowed, her shoulders rising and falling with deep, exhausted breaths. A tear dripped from her chin onto the yellowed ivory keys. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, no one made a sound. The moment was too sacred, too complete, to break with something as ordinary as applause. Then someone in the back row stood up. Sarah turned to see it was Mr. Harrison, the retired teacher who came to every community event and usually fell asleep halfway through. He wasn't asleep now. His weathered face was wet with tears and he was clapping, not politely, not casually, but with everything he had. His hands came together with sharp, loud cracks that broke the spell, and then everyone was standing. The entire room rose to their feet as if pulled by strings. The applause that erupted was deafening, even louder than the music had been. People weren't just clapping. They were cheering, shouting, crying out with joy and amazement and gratitude. Phones were forgotten, still recording from chairs or being held limply in hands. Nobody cared about the recordings anymore. They just needed to express what they had witnessed. Dorothy remained seated at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys. She seemed stunned, almost confused. She lifted her head slowly and looked out at the crowd as if just remembering where she was. The expression on her face was one of complete bewilderment. She looked around at all the standing, cheering people and seemed unable to understand what was happening. Sarah moved forward quickly, fighting through the crowd. She needed to reach Dorothy to make sure she was all right. The elderly woman looked overwhelmed, almost frightened by the response. Sarah pushed past Marcus and the spoken-word poet and finally reached the stage. "Dorothy," Sarah said, touching the older woman's shoulder gently. "Are you okay?" Dorothy looked up at her with those clear blue eyes. The room, which had been buzzing with excited conversation, fell silent again. Juilliard. Even people who knew nothing about music had heard of Juilliard. It was one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. "When?" Dr. Mitchell asked urgently. "When did you graduate?" "I didn't graduate," Dorothy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I left in my third year, in 1968, 57 years ago." Sarah did the math quickly in her head. Dorothy had to be in her mid-70s at least. She had been at Juilliard over half a century ago. "Why did you leave?" someone in the crowd asked. Sarah couldn't see who. Dorothy's hands, still resting on the piano keys, began to tremble again. The confident, powerful musician who had just commanded the entire room with her playing seemed to shrink back into the uncertain elderly woman who had walked through the door an hour ago. That's a long story," Dorothy said softly, "and it's not a very happy one." Sarah felt protective of her suddenly. This crowd, enthusiastic as they were, was overwhelming the older woman. "Maybe we should let Dorothy rest," she said loudly, addressing the room. "That was an incredible performance, and I'm sure she's exhausted." Dr. Mitchell held up a hand. "Please, just one more moment. Miss, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name." "Walsh," Dorothy said. "Dorothy Walsh." "Ms. Walsh," Dr. Mitchell continued. "Please, I need to know. Did you ever perform professionally before you stopped playing, I mean?" Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Her fingers traced patterns on the piano keys without pressing them down, making no sound. Finally, she nodded. "Yes, for a few years. I had some concerts. Nothing major. Some recitals, some appearances with orchestras. But that was all a very long time ago." "And you haven't played since?" Dr. Mitchell pressed. "Not really," Dorothy said. "Not like that. Not in. It must be 30 years now since I've touched a piano at all. Maybe longer." The crowd murmured in disbelief. 30 years without playing, and she could still do that? It seemed impossible. "Ms. Walsh," Dr. Mitchell said, and his voice was intense, urgent. "I need to ask you something. Would you consider performing again? Publicly, I mean. We have a concert series at the conservatory. Student performances, faculty performances, visiting artists. We would be honored to have you." Dorothy's eyes went wide with panic. She shook her head vigorously. No, I couldn't. I'm too old. My hands don't work properly anymore. I can't. I haven't practiced in decades. I couldn't possibly perform in front of people." "You just did," Sarah pointed out gently. "This is different," Dorothy insisted. "This was. I don't know what this was. I didn't plan it. I just sat down and started playing. A real concert would be different. There would be expectations. People would pay money. They would want perfection. I can't give them that. Not anymore." Dr. Mitchell leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Ms. Walsh, with all due respect, what you just played was extraordinary. Yes, you're older now. Yes, you haven't practiced in years. But the talent is still there. The music is still in you." That was painfully obvious to everyone in this room. Dorothy shook her head again, but less vigorously this time. Sarah could see the conflict on her face. Part of her wanted to say yes. The part that had just poured her soul into that piano wanted nothing more than to do it again. But another part, the part that had stayed away from music for 30 years, was terrified. "I need to go," Dorothy said suddenly, standing up from the piano bench. She swayed slightly, unsteady on her feet. Sarah reached out to support her. "I'm sorry, this was too much. I shouldn't have played. I should have just stayed in my seat." "Don't say that," Sarah said firmly. "What you just did was a gift. To everyone here. Please don't regret it." Dorothy looked at her with those blue eyes full of tears. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I left music behind for a reason. I had to. Playing again. It brings back too much, too many memories, too much pain." She pulled away from Sarah and started walking toward the back of the room, toward her shopping bag still sitting under the chair she had occupied. The crowd parted for her, everyone wanting to say something but not knowing what words could possibly be adequate. She moved slowly, looking at no one, her shoulders hunched. Dr. Mitchell called after her. "Ms. Walsh, please, at least think about it. Here's my card. Call me. Anytime." He hurried forward and pressed a business card into her hand. Dorothy took it without looking at it and continued walking. She reached her chair, picked up her shopping bag with trembling hands, and headed for the door. Sarah wanted to stop her, to say something, but she didn't know what. She watched helplessly as Dorothy pushed through the front door and disappeared into the October night. The room was silent for a moment. Then the conversations erupted all at once. Everyone was talking, exclaiming, asking questions. Had that really happened? Who was that woman? Where had she come from? Would she come back? Sarah looked at the piano, still and quiet now on the stage. The bench was pushed back slightly from where Dorothy had stood up. The keys still gleamed under the lights, showing the faint impressions where Dorothy's fingers had pressed them moments ago. Something extraordinary had happened tonight. Sarah knew that with absolute certainty, but she also knew that something was deeply wrong. There was a story behind Dorothy Walsh, behind her incredible talent and her long absence from music and her obvious pain. A story that needed to be told, needed to be understood. Sarah picked up her clipboard from where she had dropped it during the performance. The schedule for the rest of the evening was ruined, but nobody cared. Nobody wanted to perform after what they had just witnessed. It would be like trying to light a candle after watching the sunrise. She looked at Dr. Mitchell, who was standing near the stage, staring at the piano with a thoughtful expression. "Do you really think she could perform again?" Sarah asked him. He turned to her and his face was serious. "I think that woman has a gift that appears maybe once in a generation, maybe less often than that. What she just did, playing that piece, from memory after 30 years without practice, with arthritic hands at her age?" He shook his head in wonder. "It shouldn't be possible. But we all just watched it happen." "She seemed so scared," Sarah said. "Of course she's scared," Dr. Mitchell replied. "Whatever made her stop playing in the first place, it was something serious. Something that hurt her badly enough that she stayed away from pianos for 3 decades. That kind of pain doesn't just go away." Sarah thought about Dorothy's face as she played. The tears, the intensity, the joy mixed with sorrow. "But she loved it," she said. "You could see it. She loved playing." "That's what makes it tragic," Dr. Mitchell said quietly. "To have a gift like that and to force yourself not to use it, that must have been torture. Every single day for 30 years. Sarah made a decision. "I'm going to find her," she said. "Dorothy Walsh. I'm going to find out what happened to her, why she stopped playing. And maybe if she's willing, I can help her find her way back to music." Dr. Mitchell looked at her appraisingly. "That's a kind impulse. But be careful. Whatever drove her away from music in the first place might not be something she wants to revisit. Sometimes the past is painful for a reason." "Maybe," Sarah said. "But she walked through that door tonight. She sat down at that piano. She played. That had to mean something. She looked around the room at all the people still talking, still processing what they had witnessed. Many had their phones out, reviewing the recordings they had made. By tomorrow, those videos would be shared. Dorothy Walsh's impromptu performance would spread across the internet. The whole world would know about the elderly woman who walked into a community center and played like an angel. The question was, would Dorothy Walsh be grateful for the attention, or would it drive her even further away from the music that was so clearly still alive in her heart? Sarah didn't know the answer, but she was determined to find out. Dorothy Walsh walked home slowly through the dark streets, her shopping bag clutched tightly against her chest. Her hands were still trembling, but now it wasn't from arthritis or age. It was from the music that still echoed in her mind, in her bones, in the very core of her being. Every step she took seemed to match a rhythm, a melody, a piece of the Rachmaninoff that she had just played for the first time in 3 decades. The October night air was cool against her face, which was still damp with tears. She hadn't meant to cry while playing. She hadn't meant to play at all, not really. She had just been walking past the community center, the way she had walked past it dozens of times before, and tonight something had been different. Tonight she couldn't make herself keep walking. Dorothy lived in a small apartment 3 blocks from the community center. It was on the 2nd floor of an old building, the kind with narrow hallways and thin walls where you could hear your neighbors' televisions and arguments and laughter. She climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the railing for support. Her legs felt weak, shaky. She had used more energy in those 10 or 15 minutes at the piano than she normally used in an entire week. Inside her apartment, she set her shopping bag on the small table by the door and turned on the lamp. The warm light revealed a modest living space. A worn sofa faced an old television. A tiny kitchen occupied one corner, just big enough for one person to cook in. A bookshelf stood against one wall, filled with paperback novels and a few framed photographs. Everything was neat and clean but sparse. There was nothing unnecessary, nothing decorative except for those few pictures. Dorothy moved to the bookshelf and picked up one of the frames. It showed a young woman, maybe 23 years old, sitting at a grand piano on a concert stage. She wore a long black dress, elegant and simple, and her hair was styled in the fashion of the early 1970s. Her hands were poised over the keys, her face turned slightly toward the camera with a shy smile. The young woman in the picture looked confident and nervous at the same time, ready to share her music with the world. That young woman had been Dorothy, 52 years ago. She had been beautiful then, though she never quite believed it when people told her so. She had been talented, though she worried constantly that she wasn't good enough. She had been full of dreams and ambition, and the absolute certainty that music was her destiny. Dorothy set the frame back on the shelf and picked up another. This one showed her with a man. He was tall and handsome, with dark hair and kind eyes. They stood together in front of a church, both dressed formally. He had his arm around her waist, and she was looking up at him with an expression of pure joy. Their wedding day, June 1972. Robert. His name was Robert Walsh, and Dorothy had loved him more than she had loved anyone or anything in her life, almost as much as she had loved music. Almost. She set that picture down and moved away from the bookshelf. The memories were too much right now, piled on top of the overwhelming experience at the community center. She needed to sit down. She needed to think. Or maybe she needed to not think, to just let her mind go blank and quiet. Dorothy sank onto her sofa and closed her eyes. But the moment she did, her fingers began to move. They traced patterns in the air, pressing invisible keys, running through the Rachmaninoff again. Her muscle memory was so strong that even now, sitting alone in her apartment with no piano in sight, her hands couldn't stop playing. She forced herself to open her eyes and still her hands. She pressed them flat against her thighs, willing them to be quiet. But the music in her head wouldn't stop. It kept going, measure after measure, the complex harmonies and melodies interweaving, building, crescendoing. How was it possible that after 30 years, she could still remember it all? She had thought it was gone, buried so deep that it could never resurface. She had convinced herself that the music had died in her when Robert died, when everything else in her life had fallen apart. But tonight proved she had been wrong. The music had never died. It had just been waiting, patient and eternal, for her to let it out again. Dorothy stood up and moved to the window. She looked out at the dark street below. A few cars passed by. A couple walked hand in hand down the sidewalk. Normal life, ordinary life. The kind of life she had been living for so long that she had almost forgotten there was any other kind. But there had been another kind of life once. A life filled with music and performance and the constant pursuit of perfection. A life where every day revolved around practice and technique and preparing for the next concert, the next opportunity, the next step forward in her career. That life had started at Juilliard. Dorothy remembered the day she had received her acceptance letter. She had been 18 years old, fresh out of high school in a small town in Pennsylvania. Her parents had been supportive but worried. Music was a difficult path, they said. Not many people made it. Wouldn't she rather study something more practical like teaching or nursing? But Dorothy had been determined. She had been playing piano since she was 5 years old, and by the time she was a teenager, everyone who heard her play knew she was special. Her high school music teacher had encouraged her to audition for the best schools in the country. Juilliard had been a dream, something she barely dared to hope for. And then the acceptance letter had arrived, and the dream became real. Dorothy smiled slightly, remembering those early days in New York. She had been terrified and thrilled in equal measure. The other students were so talented, so dedicated. The professors were demanding, pushing everyone to their absolute limits and then beyond. The practice rooms were available 24 hours a day, and Dorothy had spent most of her waking hours in one of those small, soundproof rooms working on technique, on interpretation, on making her playing worthy of the great institution that had accepted her. She had thrived there. Despite her fear and self-doubt, or maybe because of it, Dorothy had worked harder than almost anyone else. By her second year, she was performing in student recitals. By her third year, she was being noticed by professors and visiting artists. Her future seemed bright, limitless, and then everything had changed. Dorothy's smile faded. She turned away from the window and sat back down on the sofa. This was the part of the story she never thought about, the part she had locked away in the deepest corner of her mind. But tonight, after playing again, after feeling the music flow through her hands like it used to, the memories wouldn't stay locked away anymore. It was February 1968. Dorothy was 20 years old, in her third year at Juilliard. She was preparing for a major recital, one that could have led to significant opportunities. She was working on several difficult pieces, including the Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 3. It was an ambitious choice, a piece that tested the limits of any pianist's technical and emotional capabilities. Dorothy had been practicing 8, sometimes 10 hours a day. She barely slept. She barely ate. All that mattered was the music, the performance, the chance to prove herself. Her professors warned her about burnout, about pushing too hard, but she didn't listen. She couldn't listen. This was her moment, her opportunity. And then one afternoon she got a phone call, her mother's voice on the other end of the line, shaky and broken. Her father had collapsed at work. A heart attack. He was in the hospital and it didn't look good. Dorothy had taken the next train to Pennsylvania. She sat by her father's bedside for 3 days. On the third day he died, his hand holding hers, his last words telling her he was proud of her, that she should go back to school, that she should keep playing. The funeral was quiet. Her mother was devastated. Dorothy's younger brother, only 15 years old, didn't know how to process his grief. The family that had always been her foundation suddenly felt fragile, broken. Her mother kept saying she would be fine, that Dorothy should go back to New York, back to her studies. But Dorothy could see the lie in her eyes. How could she go back to Juilliard? How could she sit in a practice room and work on piano techniques when her mother was alone and grieving? How could she focus on her own dreams when her family needed her? Dorothy stayed in Pennsylvania. She told herself it would just be for a few weeks, just until her mother was more stable, just until her brother adjusted. But weeks turned into months. She missed her recital. She missed the rest of the semester. By the time summer came, it was clear she wasn't going back. Juilliard sent letters. Her professors called. They urged her to return, told her she was throwing away her future. One professor, the one who had believed in her most, said that what she was doing was noble but foolish. Grief was temporary, he said. Talent like hers was forever. She needed to think about her career. But Dorothy couldn't think about her career. Every time she sat at the piano in her parents' house, every time she tried to practice, she felt guilty. How could she pursue her own happiness when her family was suffering? How could she focus on her own dreams when her mother needed her to help with bills, with her brother, with all the practical matters of life that her father had always handled? So Dorothy put music aside. She got a job at a local office, doing secretarial work. It was boring and unfulfilling, but it paid bills. She helped her mother. She helped her brother. And slowly the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the months into years. It was too painful. Music reminded her of everything she had lost. Not just her father, not just Robert, but her younger self. The girl with dreams and talent and a future that had seemed so bright. That girl had died in stages, piece by piece, until nothing was left except an elderly woman living alone, going through the motions of a life that felt like it had ended years ago, until tonight. Until she had walked past that community center and heard voices and music and laughter. Until something inside her, some part of herself she thought was dead, had whispered that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Dorothy had walked through that door. She had sat at that piano, and when her fingers touched those keys, something miraculous had happened. The music came back, all of it. The Rachmaninoff, the technique, the passion, the feeling of being completely alive and present and purposeful. For those few minutes, Dorothy wasn't an elderly woman with arthritis and a small, sad life. She was a musician again. She was who she had been meant to be all along. And then it was over, and everyone was staring at her, and that professor from the conservatory was asking her to perform, and the weight of everything came crashing back. All the reasons she couldn't do this, all the years she had lost, all the pain that music carried with it. She had run away. Again. Just like she had run away from Juilliard, from her talent, from herself. She had run because that's what she did when things got too intense, too overwhelming, too real. Dorothy looked at her hands resting in her lap. They were trembling again, but gently now. In the lamplight, she could see every spot, every wrinkle, every swollen joint. These were old hands, worn hands. Could they really make music again? Should they? She thought about Sarah, the young woman who had been so kind to her at the community center. She thought about the people in the audience, many of them crying as she played. She thought about Dr. Mitchell, the conservatory professor, looking at her with awe and urgency, begging her to consider performing. Most of all, she thought about how it had felt to play. Really play. Not just hit keys, but create music, tell stories, express emotions too deep for words. For those few minutes, she had felt whole again. She had felt like herself. Dorothy stood up and walked to her small bedroom. She opened the closet and reached up to the top shelf, pushing aside old blankets and boxes until her fingers found what she was looking for. A folder, worn and dusty, that she hadn't looked at in decades. She brought it back to the living room and sat on the sofa. With trembling hands, she opened the folder. Inside were papers yellowed with age, programs from performances at Juilliard, a newspaper clipping from her hometown paper about her acceptance to the prestigious school, letters from professors, and sheet music, carefully preserved, including a copy of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, covered in pencil marks and annotations from when she had been learning it 57 years ago. Dorothy ran her fingers over the sheet music. She could still read it. She still knew what every marking meant, what every note should sound like. The music was still in her, as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. Maybe, she thought, maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe she was foolish to think she could perform again at her age with her hands after so many years. Maybe she would fail and embarrass herself, and prove that all those years ago, she had been right to walk away, but maybe, just maybe, the music was worth the risk. Dorothy carefully put the sheet music back in the folder. She didn't know what she was going to do yet. She needed time to think, to process, to decide. But for the first time in 30 years, she allowed herself to consider the possibility. To imagine walking onto a stage again, sitting at a piano, sharing her music with an audience. The thought terrified her. But it also excited her in a way nothing had excited her in longer than she could remember. Dorothy turned off the lamp and went to bed. But she didn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, her hands moving slightly under the covers, fingers pressing invisible keys, running through music that had been locked inside her for so long. The Rachmaninoff played in her mind measure after measure, beautiful and heartbreaking, and full of all the emotions she had tried so hard not to feel for so many years. Outside her window, the city continued its nightly rhythm. Cars passed. Sirens wailed in the distance. Life went on, as it always did. But inside Dorothy's small apartment, something had shifted. Something had awakened. And whatever happened next, whatever she decided to do or not do, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She couldn't go back to pretending the music didn't exist. She couldn't spend whatever years she had left avoiding pianos and shutting down the deepest part of herself. Tonight she had played, and in playing, she had remembered who she really was. And that was something she could never forget again, no matter how hard she tried. Sarah Chen couldn't stop thinking about Dorothy Walsh. 3 days had passed since that extraordinary Tuesday night, and Sarah found herself replaying the performance in her mind constantly. She had watched the video recordings that people had posted online dozens of times. Each time she felt the same goosebumps, the same emotion, the same sense that she had witnessed something truly special. The videos had spread quickly. By Wednesday morning, Dorothy's performance was being shared across social media. By Thursday, it had been picked up by several news outlets. A local news station had done a segment about it. A classical music blog had written an article titled, "Mystery Pianist Stuns Community Center Audience." The comment sections everywhere were filled with people expressing amazement, asking questions, trying to figure out who Dorothy Walsh was and where she had come from. Sarah sat at her desk in the community center office, scrolling through the latest comments on her phone. The attention was overwhelming. She had received calls from reporters, from music bloggers, from other community centers asking if Dorothy would perform at their venues. Dr. Mitchell from the conservatory had called 3 times, asking if Sarah had any way to contact Dorothy, but Sarah didn't. Dorothy hadn't left any contact information. She had simply disappeared into the night, and Sarah had no idea how to find her. Except that wasn't quite true. Sarah knew Dorothy's full name. She knew approximately how old she was. She knew Dorothy had attended Juilliard in the late 1960s. That was enough information to start searching. Sarah had spent the past 2 days doing exactly that. She had called Juilliard's alumni office, but they said they couldn't release personal information without permission. She had tried searching online for Dorothy Walsh, but the name was common enough that she found hundreds of results. None of them clearly the woman she was looking for. She had even driven around the neighborhood near the community center, hoping to spot Dorothy on the street, but had no luck. Now it was Friday afternoon, and Sarah was running out of ideas. She set her phone down and rubbed her tired eyes. Maybe she should just give up. Maybe Dorothy didn't want to be found. Maybe the performance had been a one-time thing. A moment of weakness or strength or whatever you wanted to call it. And Dorothy had already returned to whatever life she had been living before. But Sarah couldn't accept that. Not after seeing the expression on Dorothy's face while she played. Not after witnessing the transformation from frightened elderly woman to confident, powerful musician. Dorothy needed to know that people cared, that her music mattered, that it wasn't too late. Sarah's desk phone rang, startling her. She picked it up. "Community Center, this is Sarah." "Hi, is this the person who organized the open mic night on Tuesday?" The voice was female, middle-aged, uncertain. "Yes, that's me," Sarah said. "How can I help you?" "My name is Patricia Henderson. I saw one of the videos online. The elderly woman playing piano." "Dorothy Walsh," Sarah sat up straighter. "Yes, do you know her?" There was a pause. "I think so. I mean, I knew a Dorothy Walsh a long time ago. I'm not sure if it's the same person, but the woman in the video, I watched it several times. I think it might be my old neighbor." Sarah's heart began to race. Where did she live?" "Not far from the community center, actually. Over on Maple Street. I lived next door to her for about 5 years until I moved away in 2018. We weren't close friends or anything, but we were friendly. We'd chat sometimes when we saw each other." "Did she ever mention playing piano?" Sarah asked. "No, never," Patricia said. "That's why I'm not sure if it's the same person. The Dorothy I knew was very quiet, very private. She lived alone. I never heard music coming from her apartment, and we shared a wall. I would have heard if she played piano regularly." "Do you remember the address?" Sarah asked, grabbing a pen. Patricia gave it to her. "Like I said, I don't know if she still lives there. This was 7 years ago, but maybe someone in the building knows where she went if she moved." "Thank you," Sarah said, writing down the address quickly. "Thank you so much for calling." "I hope it helps," Patricia said. "If it is the same Dorothy, please tell her. Tell her I always thought she seemed lonely. I wished I had made more effort to get to know her better. And tell her that what she played was beautiful. It made me cry." Sarah promised she would, thanked Patricia again, and hung up. She stared at the address written on her notepad. Maple Street was only 4 blocks from the community center. Dorothy had been living right in the neighborhood all along. Sarah grabbed her jacket and headed out. She needed to do this now, before she lost her nerve, before she talked herself out of it. The building on Maple Street was exactly the kind of place Patricia had described. Old, a little worn, but well-maintained. Sarah found the name Dorothy Walsh on the mailbox for apartment 2B. Her hands were shaking slightly as she pressed the buzzer. No answer. She waited 30 seconds and tried again. Still nothing. Sarah stepped back and looked up at the second-floor windows. She wasn't sure which ones belonged to apartment 2B, but none of them showed any signs of life. No lights, no movement. She tried the buzzer one more time, holding it down longer. Finally, the intercom crackled to life. Yes? The voice was faint, hesitant. But it was definitely Dorothy. Ms. Walsh? Dorothy? My name is Sarah Chen. I'm from the community center. The open mic night on Tuesday. I was hoping I could talk to you for just a few minutes. There was a long silence. Sarah waited, holding her breath. How did you find me? Dorothy's voice came through the intercom. Not angry exactly, but wary. I'm sorry if I'm intruding, Sarah said quickly. I know you left quickly the other night and maybe you don't want to be found, but I needed to talk to you, please, just a few minutes. Another silence. Then the buzzer sounded, unlocking the door. Sarah pulled it open and climbed the stairs to the second floor. Dorothy was waiting in her doorway. She looked smaller than Sarah remembered, more fragile. She wore simple clothes, a cardigan and slacks, and her white hair was pulled back in the same bun. Her blue eyes watched Sarah approach with a mixture of fear and resignation. I'm sorry to bother you, Sarah said when she reached the door. I know this is probably strange, having someone track you down like this. It's all right, Dorothy said softly. I suppose I should have expected it after what happened. Would you like to come in? Sarah stepped inside the small apartment. It was neat and spare. Exactly the kind of place she had imagined Dorothy living in. Dorothy gestured to the sofa and Sarah sat down. Can I get you something to drink? Dorothy asked. Tea, water? No, thank you, Sarah said. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Dorothy sat in the chair across from her, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at Sarah expectantly, waiting. Sarah took a deep breath. I wanted to make sure you were okay. You left so quickly the other night and you seemed upset. I was worried about you. That's kind of you, Dorothy said. I'm fine, really. I was just overwhelmed. It was too much attention. I'm not used to that anymore. The videos have been shared a lot online, Sarah said gently. Your performance, I mean. Hundreds of thousands of people have seen it. Maybe more by now. Dorothy's face paled. Oh, people are amazed, Sarah continued. Everyone wants to know about you. Who you are, where you came from, how you learned to play like that. Dr. Mitchell from the conservatory has been calling me constantly, hoping I can help him get in touch with you. Dorothy looked down at her hands. I don't know what to tell them. You don't have to tell them anything, Sarah assured her. That's not why I'm here. I'm not trying to pressure you or convince you to do anything you don't want to do. I just wanted to make sure you knew that what you did that night mattered to people. It moved them. It changed them in some small way. That's a gift. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean for it to happen. I was just going to play a little bit, just to see if I could still do it. And then something took over and I couldn't stop. The music just poured out of me. Why did you stop playing? Sarah asked softly. You told Dr. Mitchell you hadn't played in 30 years. What happened? Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Sarah waited, not pushing, just giving her space to decide whether she wanted to share. Finally, Dorothy began to speak. She told Sarah everything. About Juilliard, about her father's death, about leaving school to take care of her family, about Robert and their life together, about the arthritis and the aging and the years of avoiding anything that reminded her of music, about all the grief and loss and guilt that had piled up until music had become too painful to touch. Sarah listened without interrupting. By the time Dorothy finished, both women were crying. I'm so sorry, Sarah said. I can't imagine how hard all of that must have been. It was my choice, Dorothy said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. I chose family over music. I chose Robert over a career. I don't regret those choices, but I do regret that I let the music die completely. I should have found a way to keep it alive, even in some small way. Instead, I buried it so deep that I convinced myself it was gone forever. But it wasn't gone, Sarah said. It was just waiting. Dorothy smiled slightly. No, it wasn't gone. Tuesday night proved that, so what now? Sarah asked. Dr. Mitchell's offer is real. The conservatory would love to have you perform. I care, Sarah said simply. And I think you care too. I think part of you wants to do this, wants to play again. Otherwise, you wouldn't have walked into that community center on Tuesday. You would have kept walking past the way I'm guessing you've walked past hundreds of times before. Dorothy couldn't argue with that. I'm scared, she admitted. Of course you are, Sarah said. But being scared doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Sometimes the things that scare us the most are the things we need to do the most. Dorothy stood up and walked to her bookshelf. She picked up the photograph of herself at Juilliard, the young woman ready to share her music with the world. She stared at it for a long time. She was so confident, Dorothy said softly. That girl in the picture. She believed in herself. She believed music was her calling. I don't know if I can find that belief again. Maybe you don't need to believe the same way she did, Sarah suggested. Maybe you can believe in a different way. Not as a young woman starting out, but as someone who's lived a full life, who's experienced loss and love and heartbreak and joy. Maybe your music now can mean something different than it would have meant then. Dorothy turned to look at her. That's actually quite insightful, Sarah smiled. I have my moments. Dorothy set the photograph back on the shelf. She was quiet for a minute, thinking. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger, more certain. If I were to consider this, she said slowly, and I'm not saying I am, but if I were, I would need time. I would need to practice to see if my hands can really do this. I would need to prepare properly. Of course, Sarah said, trying not to show how excited she felt. Take all the time you need. And it would have to be small, Dorothy continued. Not a big concert hall with hundreds of people. Something more intimate, more like what happened on Tuesday. We could do it at the community center, Sarah offered immediately. We could organize a special event. Keep it small, just for the local community. No pressure. Dorothy looked uncertain again. I don't know. I need to think about it more. That's fine, Sarah said. She pulled out her phone. Can I give you my number? That way you can call me when you've decided. No pressure, no deadline. Just call me if and when you're ready. Dorothy nodded. Sarah wrote her number on a piece of paper and handed it to her. Thank you for coming, Dorothy said as Sarah stood to leave. And thank you for being so kind. I wasn't expecting that. You deserve kindness, Sarah said. You deserve to have people support you and believe in you. She walked to the door, then turned back. Dorothy, can I ask you one more question? Yes. When you were playing on Tuesday in that moment, were you happy? Dorothy's eyes softened. A small, genuine smile appeared on her face. Yes, she said quietly. I was happy. For the first time in a very long time, I felt completely, perfectly happy. Then that's all that matters, Sarah said. Everything else is just details. She left the apartment and walked back down the stairs. Outside, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the street. Sarah felt hopeful. She had found Dorothy. She had opened the door, at least a crack. Now it was up to Dorothy to decide whether she would walk through it. Sarah pulled out her phone and called Dr. Mitchell. He answered on the first ring. Did you find her? He asked immediately. I did, Sarah said. I talked to her. She's considering it. She needs time, but she's considering it. Dr. Mitchell let out a long breath. Thank God. I was afraid she had disappeared forever. What did she say? She's scared, Sarah explained. And she has good reasons to be, but I think she wants to do it. She just needs to work through her fear first. Do you think she'll actually go through with it? Dr. Mitchell asked. Sarah thought about Dorothy's face when she asked if she had been happy while playing. That smile, small but real. That simple, honest yes, I think she will, Sarah said. I really think she will. She just needs to believe in herself again, and we need to give her the space and support to do that. Whatever she needs, Dr. Mitchell said. Whatever it takes. A talent like hers, it would be a crime to let it stay hidden. Sarah hung up and started walking back toward the community center. The evening air was cool and fresh, and she felt energized in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. Something good was happening. Something important. In her apartment on Maple Street, Dorothy stood at her window watching Sarah walk away down the street. The young woman moved with purpose, with confidence, with the kind of energy that Dorothy had once possessed but thought she had lost forever. Dorothy looked down at the piece of paper in her hand, with Sarah's phone number on it. Then she looked at the business card Dr. Mitchell had given her on Tuesday night, which she had placed on the table by the door. She hadn't thrown either of them away. That had to mean something. Dorothy walked to her bedroom closet and pulled out the folder she had looked at the other night. The sheet music, the programs, the newspaper clippings, evidence of a life she had lived long ago, of a person she had been. She spread the Rachmaninoff sheet music out on her table and sat down in front of it. Her fingers traced the notes, reading through the first page, then the second. She could hear it in her head, every note, every dynamic marking, every subtle shift in tempo and emotion. It was still there. All of it, waiting. Dorothy picked up her phone. It was old and simple, just a basic flip phone that she used for emergencies and occasional calls. She looked at Sarah's number for a long time. She wasn't ready to call yet. But maybe, just maybe, she would be ready soon. For now, it was enough to know that the possibility existed, that the door was open, that if she chose to walk through it, there would be people on the other side ready to support her. Dorothy set the phone down and looked at the sheet music again. Then very slowly her hands rose, her fingers curved into position, hovering over an invisible keyboard. And there, in her small apartment with no piano in sight, Dorothy began to practice. Her fingers moved through the air, pressing invisible keys, running through passages she hadn't physically played in 30 years. Her muscle memory was still there, strong and certain. Her hands remembered what her mind had tried to forget. She practiced for an hour, running through the Rachmaninoff, working on the difficult passages, reminding herself of the fingering and the phrasing and all the tiny details that separated good playing from great playing. When she finally stopped, her hands were tired but felt more alive than they had in years. The arthritis still hurt, but less than usual. It was as if the music itself was medicine, healing not just her spirit but her body too. Dorothy looked out her window at the darkening sky. Stars were beginning to appear, tiny points of light in the vast darkness. Maybe, she thought, just maybe. The word hung in her mind like the last note of a beautiful piece of music, fading slowly but never quite disappearing completely. Maybe. 2 weeks passed before Dorothy called Sarah. 2 weeks of silent contemplation, of practicing with invisible keys in her apartment, of waking up in the middle of the night with music running through her mind. 2 weeks of being terrified and excited in equal measure. When Sarah's phone rang on a Monday morning and she saw the unfamiliar number, she almost didn't answer. But something made her pick up. Hello? Sarah? This is Dorothy Walsh. The voice was quiet but steady. Sarah's heart leaped. Dorothy! It's so good to hear from you. I've been thinking, Dorothy said, about what you said, about performing again. And I think I'd like to try, if the offer is still open. Sarah wanted to scream with joy but kept her voice calm. Of course it's still open, absolutely. What made you decide? Dorothy was quiet for a moment. I've been practicing, in my apartment without a piano. Just moving my fingers, remembering the music, and I realized that I was happy doing even that. Just the act of engaging with music again, even without an instrument, brought me joy. And I thought, if that makes me happy, maybe actually playing for people again would make me even happier. Or maybe I'll fail and embarrass myself. But either way, I need to try. You won't fail, Sarah said firmly. But I understand being scared. When would you like to do this? I need time to prepare, Dorothy said. Real time. With a real piano. I can't just walk onto a stage again. I need to practice properly. The community center has the piano, Sarah offered. You could practice there whenever you want. I can give you a key. You could come early in the morning or late at night when no one else is around if you don't want an audience. That would be... Dorothy's voice caught. That would be wonderful. Thank you. They made arrangements. Sarah would meet Dorothy at the community center the next morning at 6 a.m. before anyone else arrived. She would give Dorothy a key and access to the building. Dorothy could practice on her own schedule, as much or as little as she wanted. When Sarah arrived at the community center at 5:45 the next morning, Dorothy was already waiting outside. She had her shopping bag with her, but this time Sarah could see sheet music sticking out of the top. You're early, Sarah said, smiling as she unlocked the door. I couldn't sleep, Dorothy admitted. I've been awake since 4. They went inside together. The building was quiet and dark, lit only by emergency lights. Sarah turned on the lights in the main hall, and there it was, the Baldwin upright, sitting on the stage exactly where it had been 2 weeks ago. Dorothy stared at it for a long moment. Then she walked slowly toward it, her footsteps echoing in the empty room. Take all the time you need, Sarah said. I'll be in my office if you need anything. The building is yours. She left Dorothy alone with the piano. As she walked to her office, she heard the first tentative notes. Simple scales, testing the keys, relearning the feel of the instrument. Then the scales became more complex, and soon Dorothy was playing exercises, warm-ups, technical drills. Sarah smiled and got to work on her computer. She had planning to do. Over the next 3 weeks, Dorothy came to the community center almost every day, sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late at night, sometimes in the middle of the afternoon. Sarah made sure no one disturbed her. She told the other staff members that the piano was being used for a special project and wasn't available for general use. Some days, Sarah would sit in her office and listen to the music drifting down the hallway. She heard Dorothy work through the same difficult passages over and over, perfecting them. She heard her play pieces Sarah didn't recognize, classics from the standard piano repertoire. And she heard her play the Rachmaninoff, that incredible piece from the first night, but now with even more confidence, more polish, more emotion. Dorothy's hands were getting stronger. The daily practice was actually helping her arthritis. The swelling decreased. The stiffness eased. It was as if her body, like her spirit, was coming back to life through the music. One afternoon, Sarah walked into the hall during Dorothy's practice session. Dorothy didn't notice her at first, too absorbed in what she was playing. Sarah sat down quietly in the back row and listened. When Dorothy finished the piece, she looked up and saw Sarah sitting there. Instead of being startled or upset, she smiled. "How long have you been there?" she asked. "Just a few minutes," Sarah said. "You sound incredible. How are you feeling about everything?" Dorothy flexed her fingers, looking at them thoughtfully. "Better than I expected. My hands are remembering things I thought they'd forgotten, and the arthritis is actually improving with all this use. My doctor would probably tell me to be careful, but honestly, I feel better than I have in years." "So you're still planning to do the performance?" Sarah asked. Dorothy took a deep breath. "Yes, I think so. I'm terrified, but yes." "When?" Sarah asked. "Just tell me when you're ready and I'll set everything up." Dorothy thought for a moment. "A month from now. That gives me 6 more weeks total to practice. Is that enough time to organize something?" "More than enough," Sarah assured her. "I was thinking we could do it on a Tuesday night like the regular open mic. But this would be a special event, just for you. We'll keep it small, just the local community like you wanted. Maybe we can reach out to some local music lovers, some of the people who saw the videos, and Dr. Mitchell if you're comfortable with that." "Dr. Mitchell can come," Dorothy said. "After all, this might be my only chance to play for someone from the conservatory. I should take advantage of it," Sarah laughed. "You're selling yourself short. But okay, I'll make sure he knows." Over the next few weeks, Sarah quietly spread the word. She posted about the event on the community center's social media, but kept it low-key. Local pianist to perform special concert. She didn't mention Dorothy's name or the viral video, not wanting to create a circus atmosphere. This was supposed to be small and intimate, supportive rather than overwhelming. But word spread anyway. The few people Sarah told others. The story was too good to keep quiet. The mysterious elderly pianist who had stunned everyone was going to perform again. People wanted to be there. By the week of the performance, Sarah had received over 200 requests for seats. The community center's main hall only held about 80 people comfortably. She called Dorothy to warn her. "There's a lot more interest than I expected." "I'm sorry. I tried to keep it quiet, but people are excited. We can turn people away if it's too much." To her surprise, Dorothy laughed. "It's all right. I suppose I should have expected this." The videos did get a lot of attention. Let whoever wants to come. We'll figure it out. Sarah rented extra chairs. She set up a small stage area, making sure the piano would be positioned perfectly for acoustics. She arranged for better lighting than the overhead fluorescents they usually used. She wanted this to feel special, professional, worthy of Dorothy's talent. The night before the performance, Sarah found Dorothy at the community center, practicing late. It was almost 11 p.m. "You should go home and rest," Sarah said gently. "You'll need your energy tomorrow." "I know," Dorothy said. "I just wanted to run through everything one more time, to make sure." "You're ready," Sarah told her. "Trust me, you're more than ready." Dorothy's hands rested on the keys. "I keep thinking about my father. He died when I was working on this piece, the Rachmaninoff. I never got to perform it for him. He never knew how it turned out." "He knew you were talented," Sarah said. "He believed in you." "His last words to me were that I should keep playing," Dorothy said softly. "He made me promise, but I didn't keep that promise. Not for very long anyway." You're keeping it now, Sarah pointed out. Dorothy smiled. I suppose I am. 57 years late, but better late than never. And Robert? Sarah asked. Your husband. What would he think about all this? Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears. He would be so proud. He always wished I would play again. He said it was a shame to waste such a gift, but he never pushed me. He just accepted me as I was. She wiped her eyes. I wish he could be here to see this. Both of them, really. My father and Robert, the two men who loved me most in the world. They'll be here, Sarah said. In a way. In the music, Dorothy nodded. Yes, in the music. The next evening, Sarah arrived at the community center 3 hours before the performance was scheduled to start. She wanted everything to be perfect. She checked the chairs, the lighting, the temperature. She made sure the piano was in tune. She set up a small refreshment table with water and cookies. Dr. Mitchell arrived early as well. He was dressed formally in a suit and tie, as if attending a concert at Carnegie Hall rather than a community center. He examined the piano critically, played a few notes, and nodded approvingly. It's not a Steinway, he said, but it's decent. And honestly, after what I heard in that video, I don't think the quality of the piano matters much. She could probably make a toy keyboard sound like a masterpiece. People began arriving at 6:30, even though the performance wasn't scheduled until 7:30. Sarah had put out 80 chairs but ended up having to set up 20 more. People stood along the walls when the chairs ran out. The room was packed, filled with a mixture of local community members, music lovers who had traveled from across the city, and even a few reporters who had somehow heard about the event. At 7:15, Sarah went to find Dorothy. At 7:30, Sarah walked onto the small stage area. The crowd quieted immediately. You could feel the anticipation in the air, thick and electric. Good evening, everyone, Sarah said. Thank you all for coming tonight. This is a very special evening for our community center. A few weeks ago, a woman walked through our doors during our regular open mic night. She sat down at our piano and played something extraordinary. Many of you saw the videos. You know what I'm talking about? The crowd murmured in agreement. Sarah continued. That woman is here with us tonight. She has spent the last several weeks preparing to perform for you again. Her name is Dorothy Walsh, and she has a story that I hope she'll share with you in her own time. But for now, all you need to know is that she's incredibly talented, incredibly brave, and we're honored to have her here. Please welcome Dorothy Walsh. The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. Sarah stepped aside and Dorothy walked onto the stage. She moved slowly but with dignity, her head held high. When she reached the piano bench and turned to face the audience, Sarah saw her hands were shaking, but her face was calm, composed. Thank you, Dorothy said softly. Then, realizing people in the back couldn't hear her, she cleared her throat and spoke louder. Thank you all for coming. I'm not used to speaking to audiences. I never was very good at it even when I was young. A few people chuckled warmly. Dorothy smiled. I stopped playing piano 30 years ago. I had my reasons, most of them having to do with loss and grief and feeling like music was too painful to touch. But a few weeks ago I walked past this building and heard music, and something inside me that I thought was dead woke up. I sat down at this piano intending to play just a few notes. Instead, I played something much bigger, something I didn't know was still in me. She paused, looking out at the audience. Sarah saw tears in her eyes. Tonight I want to play for you again, not because I'm trying to recapture my youth or prove anything or start some new career. I'm 77 years old. My time for grand careers is past. I'm playing because music is who I am, who I've always been, and denying that was like denying my own heartbeat. So thank you for being here to witness this. Thank you for giving an old woman a chance to remember what it feels like to be whole. She turned to the piano and sat down. She adjusted the bench, flexed her fingers, took a deep breath. The room was so quiet that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. Dorothy placed her hands on the keys, and then she began to play. She started with something gentle and lyrical, a Chopin nocturne. The notes floated through the air like silk, delicate and beautiful. People in the audience leaned forward, not wanting to miss a single note. After the Chopin, she played Debussy, a piece that sounded like water flowing over stones, soft and dreamy. Then something by Bach, structured and mathematical and absolutely perfect. And then, after playing for about 20 minutes, she paused. She looked out at the audience. This last piece, she said, is the piece I was working on when my father died. I never got to perform it for him. I never finished learning it. It's one of the most difficult pieces in the piano repertoire. I'm not sure I can do it justice tonight. My hands aren't what they used to be. But I'm going to try because this piece means everything to me. It represents all the music I lost, all the dreams I set aside, and all the love that sustained me through the years when I wasn't playing. She turned back to the piano. This is Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, first movement. And then she played. If her performance weeks ago had been extraordinary, this was transcendent. Dorothy had practiced. She had prepared. Every note was perfect, every phrase shaped with intention and emotion. Her hands moved across the keys with power and delicacy, switching between thunderous chords and whisper-soft passages. The music built and built, layer upon layer, until it seemed impossible that one person could create such sound, such complexity, such overwhelming beauty. Dorothy's whole body moved with the music, swaying, leaning, putting everything she had into every measure. Sarah, standing at the back of the room, felt tears streaming down her face. She looked around and saw she wasn't alone. Nearly everyone was crying. Dr. Mitchell sat in the front row with his eyes closed, conducting slightly with one hand, completely lost in the music. The difficult passages, the ones that challenged even professional pianists in their prime, Dorothy played with ease. Her arthritic hands, strengthened by weeks of practice, moved with certainty and grace. It was as if the music itself was healing her, giving her back the physical abilities she thought were lost forever. The piece built toward its climax. Dorothy's hands flew across the keyboard faster and faster, louder and louder. The old Baldwin piano rang out with everything it had, every string vibrating, every hammer striking true. And then the final chord, massive and powerful and final. Dorothy held it, letting the sound fill the room, letting it echo off the walls and through every heart present. When the sound finally faded to silence, she sat with her hands still on the keys, her head bowed, tears running down her face. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was complete, sacred, profound. Then the applause began. Not polite, appreciative applause, but roaring, standing, shouting approval. Everyone was on their feet, clapping, cheering, crying. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, joyous. Dorothy lifted her head and looked out at the audience. She seemed surprised, almost confused by the response. Then she stood up and took a small, modest bow. The applause grew even louder. Dr. Mitchell rushed onto the stage, not caring about protocol or procedure. He grabbed Dorothy's hands in his and said something Sarah couldn't hear over the applause. Dorothy nodded, crying harder now. He pulled her into a hug and she let him, this stranger who understood what her music meant because he too had devoted his life to it. The applause continued for a full 2 minutes. Finally, Dorothy held up one hand, asking for quiet. Slowly, the crowd settled down, though no one sat. They all stood, waiting to hear what she would say. "Thank you," Dorothy said, her voice shaking. "Thank you all. I didn't know if I could still do this. I didn't know if I should even try. But tonight, with all of you here, I remembered why I love music in the first place. It's not about perfection or fame or career. It's about connection. It's about sharing something beautiful with other people. It's about being human together." She paused, wiping her eyes. "My father told me to keep playing. My husband wished I would play again. But I couldn't, not for so many years. Tonight, I finally kept my promise to them. And to myself. So thank you. Thank you for letting me come home." The applause erupted again, even louder than before. Dorothy smiled through her tears, bowed once more, and then Sarah was there, guiding her off the stage, protecting her from the crowd that wanted to rush forward, to touch her, to tell her how much her music had moved them. In the small room behind the stage, Dorothy collapsed into a chair, exhausted and elated and overwhelmed. Sarah brought her water. "You did it," Sarah said. "Dorothy, you were incredible." "I can't believe I did that," Dorothy said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I really did it. After all these years, I actually did it." Dr. Mitchell appeared in the doorway. "Ms. Walsh, I don't want to intrude, but I must tell you, that was one of the finest performances of that piece I've ever heard. And I've heard it performed hundreds of times by professionals half your age." Dorothy shook her head in disbelief. "You're too kind. I'm not being kind. I'm being honest." He crouched down so he was at eye level with her. "You have a gift that deserves to be shared. I know you're tired and I know this was a lot. But please think about doing more. The conservatory would be honored to host you. We could organize a full recital, properly promoted, professionally recorded. You could share your music with thousands of people instead of just the lucky ones who were here tonight. Dorothy looked uncertain. I don't know. This was so overwhelming. You don't have to decide now, Dr. Mitchell said. Just think about it. Promise me you'll think about it. I promise, Dorothy said. Over the next hour, Dorothy spoke with many people from the audience. They waited patiently for their turn to tell her how much her performance had meant to them. An elderly man told her that her playing had reminded him of his late wife, who had also been a pianist. A young woman said she had been ready to give up her own music studies, but Dorothy's story inspired her to keep trying. A mother with tears in her eyes said she would never forget this night, and that she was going to tell her daughter about the woman who proved it's never too late to reclaim your dreams. Finally, the crowd dispersed. The community center emptied. It was just Sarah and Dorothy sitting in the now quiet hall. Are you ready to go home? Sarah asked. Dorothy looked at the piano still sitting on the stage under the lights. Can I sit here for just a moment? Just to take it all in? Of course, Sarah said. Dorothy walked back onto the stage and sat down at the piano. She placed her hands on the keys but didn't press down, just rested them there. I spent so many years running from this, she said softly. So many years thinking that music was in my past, that it was something I had lost and could never get back. But it was never gone. It was just waiting for me to be brave enough to come back to it.